if we come back to the heart of servant leadership, it's putting others, right, something or someone before ourselves. And so if we can come together as, multiple generations and really get clear on, again, what is the purpose here? Is the purpose for, Gen 1 to just continue to, run this, and for me as G2 as an example, to basically be a hired hand? I mean, so a lot of whether you're talking about, work relationships, family relationships, marital relationships, right? Clear, open communication and clear expectations, I think are so, so
Clear.
important. There's a book out there called Lead with Love, LUV, and it's written by Colleen Barrett, one-time president of Southwest Airlines,
That would be a good read.
right? And LUV is the ticker symbol for Southwest Airlines. Most people would think it'd be SWA. No, it's LUV. So that book, Lead with Love, she talks about how they took those 8 behaviors of love from 1 Corinthians 13, and that shaped the culture of Southwest Airlines. Southwest Airlines, Colleen Barrett, she said, you know what? We can't serve all people. You know who we serve? Our employees. Because we believe if we take care of our employees, they'll take care of customers. And if the employees take care of customers, they'll take care of shareholders.
Welcome to the Farm Family Harmony podcast. I'm Elaine Fraze, Farm Family Coach, here with another episode full of transition tips, tactics, and sometimes hard truths to get harmony on your farm. Hi there, folks. It's Elaine Fraze, Farm Family Coach, coming to you today from my farmhouse in southwestern Manitoba. And I'm really excited for all of you out there, especially for founders and the older generation, to meet my friend Andrew Leikvoll. And Andrew and I met, I think, originally through LinkedIn, and then he stalked me. No, he didn't stalk me. He actually showed up at my presentation for Compeer in Mystic Lake, Minnesota. And Andrew is in the Midwest. And Andrew, you have given me this book, which I've read and wrote voracious notes on, and it's called Leading Jesus's Way, and it's on servant-hearted leadership. So that's my focus today, listeners, for the podcast, is to have Andrew coach us, particularly as the aging farmers or aging leaders in your business, even if it's not a farm, as to how you want to make this a good situation for being the kind of leader you want to be. So Andrew, tell us the name of your company and what are you coaching about?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and just to reconnect with, someone who's turned out to be a great friend and a mentor to many ways in my journey here around leadership and coaching and consulting. I'm based in West Central Minnesota, so about 90 miles west of the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. Very rural area, very agriculturally based area. And the work that we do, well, first, the organization is Triune Leadership Services. And all the work we do is centered around servant leadership. So sometimes I just basically phrase it that we're basically a coaching and consulting organization all around servant leadership. And oftentimes people might have a bit of a misconception or maybe ambiguity around that term, servant leadership. I think for most people, it's a positive term, but oftentimes is somewhat ambiguous. And so basically at the end of the day, it's all about putting others, right, before ourselves, whether that's our team, our family, our coworkers, our organization. In the academic literature, the term servant leadership shows up around 1970, and it's credited to a gentleman named Robert Greenleaf, who authored an academic paper you can look up called The Servant as Leader. Now, for us at Triune, our founder is a gentleman named Mark Dieterding, and in 2016, he authored a book, the book you referenced, Leading Jesus' Way, with the idea being that the ultimate or original model servant leader was Jesus Christ himself. And so for me and for our team, being Christians, being followers of Christ, that's a very natural inclination. But we have the opportunity to speak certainly and work with a lot of, families, but also very large corporations. And at the end of the day, I'm quick to say, even secular news sources like Time Magazine and so forth recognize the person of Jesus Christ was a real person who really lived. He was a real historical figure. And they recognize that he was the most influential person of all time. And so, certainly there is a lot for us to learn as we look at his life and leadership. Again, we're never going to measure up 100%, but there is so much rich lessons and learning to be taken from the pages of scripture in terms of really how to lead, right? How to lead well. Here's someone who you might say took a senior leadership team of 12 and fast forward today, depending on who you believe, somewhere between 2.5 and 3 billion people identify themselves as followers of this individual.
Right. And so the nice thing about my relationship with you too is learning from you, Andrew, that the values and the character of servant leadership, why I invited you onto this podcast, my intention for us today in this conversation is to take what you know to be true from the coaching that you've done and from servant leadership and put that in the model of what would it look like in a farm family where the dad and the mom, who are the founders, my age in their mid 60s or late 60s, and the next gen, which would be my son Ian, who's 36, and his wife. What if we all ascribed to this value of serving one another? And it really, in the work I do, I have this presentation called Culture Beat Strategy. And basically, it's what it is that we believe to be true. How do we behave with each other and how do we make decisions? So, can you just lay that out? Because I wrote a quote from the book just as a throw out here. There is no leadership without leadership by example. So,
Mhm.
how do you coach the founders of these businesses? And you work with large corporations, not just farm families, you work with all kinds of people. There is no leadership without leadership by example. So, how do we have a conversation with the older founding generation about their need to lead their farm family business or their need to lead their business?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I would probably frame it up this way, Elaine. You know as well as anyone that just the whole area of farming and agriculture has evolved dramatically in the past 20, 30 years. And so I would say, I didn't grow up on a farm, but I do come from a rich heritage of farming families, particularly on my mother's side. And back in my grandfather's day, it was typically one person on the farm, tended to be maybe a little bit of the rugged individualist. There was kind of maybe a certain personality, bent or traits there. And there may or may have not been, maybe one hired hand, but that was kind of the typical farm family. Today, most farms, right, including family owned farms, which I know is the thrust of your audience, are highly complex organizations, right? A million, multi-million, oftentimes tens of millions of dollar businesses. And if you or I were going to come out of, college and say, we're going to go create a 10, 20, $30 million business, we wouldn't just, whip up an idea in our mind and say, let's go. We would take a disciplined approach. And that doesn't mean taking the family out of the farm, right? I would say actually there's even a heightened level of complexity because we're taking the profession, right, and the personal, the family, and we're taking them together. And so, so much more complexity here than even in other businesses that might be multiple size larger. And so the work that we do using the model that we believe Jesus taught is we start with the foundation. And this is a lot of what you just talked about, Elaine. In our mind, that means the purpose, vision, and values. Now, some people prefer the word mission over purpose. That's fine. Just know when you hear me say purpose, that can be synonymous with mission. And
Right.
so one of the first things we do is come alongside the individuals and help them discern their personal purpose, vision, and values. And that sets a bit of a precedent because Elaine, it helps them step away from the business, right? For so many people, I'll speak as a male in particular, our identity is so tied to our work. And
You
so,
do.
exactly right. So, what if I could detach my personal identity and see that I have a unique purpose, that I'm able to use that farm as a vehicle to live out my purpose, but it's not my identity. And once we can, get and oftentimes it's multiple generations, but once we help them discern their personal purpose, vision, and values, then we can lean in and say, okay, now let's take a look at the farm as a business. What's the business's purpose, right? What's the farm's purpose? What's the farm's vision? What are the farm's values? And when I say values, I'm talking about 3 to 5 core values, but I'm not talking about just values. I'm talking about definitions, right? So we have to clearly define what are those values. And then we take it a step further and we define a set of behaviors for each value. And once that's established, Elaine, it doesn't matter if I'm first generation, second generation, third generation, that becomes the standard, right? It's not just what dad says or what grandpa says or whatever the case is. We align around that and say, this is the standard. If you're going to be a part of this farm organization, this is the way we're going to treat one another. This is the way we're going to interact with one another. And I expect to be held accountable, as well as being able to hold those around the table accountable to the values and behaviors we've defined.
So, Andrew, when you sift that down to those core beliefs and values, how we're going to behave with each other, do you make that into a word cloud and post it on the wall, or how do you keep what's the next step for keeping people accountable to what they said? Because on our farm, we use the value style indicator, which is a tool our team has from the work of Dr. Ken Keese. And I'm the only one on our team who has a high value for independence, which is why I'm away speaking or leaving the farm for, 10 or 15 times a year to speak or do other things. But the rest of the team has a very high value for teamwork. So not all of those core values will be aligned or exactly the same. But how do you then walk the talk going forward? How do you keep people accountable for showing up with the behavior that they promised would match what they truly value?
Yeah, great question. So when I first read Leading Jesus Way, right, the book written by our founder, I was a part of a healthcare startup, and we had had a lot of success. We had a very well defined mission, vision, and values. We had done great work on that. But then you know where that lived, Elaine? I
Yeah.
think it lived on the wall in the lobby at the headquarters, and I'm pretty sure it was in the handbook, the new employee handbook. And that was it. That was it. So when I began to understand these principles of servant leadership, step one, and this is not rocket science, but it was bringing those out in our weekly meeting, right? And it just started as simple recitation. So at our weekly meeting, we would state our purpose. We would state our vision. We would walk through the values and behaviors, and then we would recognize one another. Hey, in the past week, where did you see one of your teammates or someone else in the organization live out one of these values? And so that's step one, is just keeping it alive, keeping it in front of people, reviewing it often, right? And then it becomes a part of the hiring process. So first you're kind of circling around the table as owners, as family members, but then that begins to be the filter when you do go out to hire. Because again, a lot of these, farm organizations today are large. They require, multiple team members, employees, etc. That then becomes the filter that we hire. It becomes the filter that we do performance reviews. I've seen some of our clients where they'll take that set of behaviors and they'll actually make that part of the performance review, and they'll do peer evaluation and seeing where where they net out on those behaviors. That can dictate, in some cases, up to 40% of the variable compensation for that individual. So performance matters. And that's probably the great misconception around servant leadership, is that it's soft. We can actually show our clients empirically servant-led organizations outperform. Whether it's in the private sector, the public sector, our society is filled with cases of organizations who put people first that thrive in the long term.
Well,
And
I just need to check in with that too, is that I just listened to Lacey Owens speak at the Convergence conference last week in Regina, and by the time this airs, it'll be mid-April, but that conference was the beginning of February, and she talked about taking care of your people first, right? And I'm never going to be out of work, Andrew, as a coach, because as you know, conflict resolution is a thing when people are not aligned with what their purpose, vision, and values are.
Mhm.
So you see this whether or not an organization subscribes to what their faith base is. It's the whole model of servant leadership. So let's talk a little bit more about. Um, there's a quote in the book, and I was flipping through my book again today because when I read this, it said, "Living in the past delays progress," and I said, "Farmers who are living in the past, like you said, agriculture is not the same that it was in 1970 when this servant leadership idea was born."
Mhm.
We're now in 2025. So not only are you looking at purpose, vision, and values, talk about how founders can delay progress by living in the past or not letting go of control. Because servant-led leadership is not about you having all the control. So tell me what it does mean.
Yeah, I love that. So
Because, I bet I hear every week, Elaine, we're having some issues here because mom or dad will not let go.
absolutely. And so I'm just going to bring it back to the model in terms of kind of framing up that question. So we talked about there's 5 parts to the model. We basically have talked about the first one, which we label the foundation. And again, that's purpose, vision, values. And then if I had a visual pulled up, you would see there's 3 pillars. Okay. And the first pillar is energy. The second is performance, which we just touched on a moment ago. The third is relationships. And so I'm going to talk about that energy one for just a minute because I think that gets to the heart of some of what you asked there. Again, oftentimes we don't have a great onboarding, plan for people, for team. We bring somebody on and we may show them, what to do, but more or less we tend to throw them in the deep end of the pool. That's exactly right. And so we talk in building energy around putting up appropriate boundaries, right? And putting your people in control of the goal. So Elaine, yeah, again, whether I'm in the corporate world, whether I'm on the family farm, if I hire somebody day one and I hire you, Elaine, and I say, all right, here's what I need you to do. Be sure those cows are fed. Be sure that gets planted. Be sure that, we fix this fence. I'll check in 30 days. Let me know if you need anything. That's going to suck the energy out of people, right? It's going to overwhelm them. They're not going to know what to do. So in the beginning, in most cases, unless I have a highly competent, highly experienced individual, I'm going to give very narrow boundaries, right? Elaine, day one, we're going to do this, right? And the first half of the morning, we're going to do this. I'm going to show you this. And then this afternoon, we're going to do this, this, and this. And then day 2, 3, etc. Right? And if I show you, I've got a 30-day plan as an example, all of a sudden that builds energy, right? That gets you really engaged because there's a plan. Now, if I'm
Well,
still managing,
clear time. You're
that's
being
right.
very clear. Sorry,
That's
go ahead.
right. Now, if I'm still managing you in 3-hour increments, six months in, right? So as the competency, right, and the experience grows, I'm going to broaden those boundaries. So it's taking an appropriate, style of leadership based on where, people are at. And that will help, again, build energy, build that confidence and so forth. And I also want to show people the importance of the work they're doing, right? Somebody is not just loading corn, out of this bin in that truck going there. I mean, that's the importance of the purpose. If I have an overarching purpose to my organization, then I can show people how the work they're doing, loading a truck, right? Branding cattle. I mean, I can show them how that ties in, to something much more broadly. And that,
Well,
of course, builds energy.
so the energy gets sucked out of young farmers, Andrew, when dad or mom or the older generation or the outgoing management, so to speak, is micromanaging. Elaine,
That's right.
when are they going to trust me? Or why does it have to be dad's way or the highway? So again, servant-based leadership is around the, and I have often used the term distracted management that is highly conflict involved is sucking the energy, the good energy that could go towards people managing more independent. And of course, I think the goal in this letting go of control scenario, Andrew, is to trust that the next generation is going to do a good job because you've trained them well, and to trust they're not going to screw up and lose the whole farm and fail, which is another hidden angst that a lot of founders don't want to talk about because they are afraid of letting go. And then it also ties back to what you said too earlier about identity. As a servant-based leader, your identity is not grounded in what you actually do. It's more about who you are. And so this is also important with why I think all the listeners of this podcast should get Mark Dieter's book called Leading Jesus Way, because it has so many practical pieces of language to help you shift so that your identity is tied up in serving each other for the good of the whole farm, rather than, well, I'm the guy, I'm the one, and don't you dare tell me I have to step back, because who am I if I can't call myself the main manager? And I think what you're saying is the goal is performance to be shared and for control not to be in a
Yeah.
hurtful or constraining way.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, most organizations we work with, Elaine, they want to be innovative, right? They want to continuously improve. But to your point, when I ask them if that's true, if that's a value of your organization, tell me about your tolerance for risk. And
Mm.
all of a sudden it gets very quiet, right? Because these aren't mutually exclusive. If you want to innovate and continually improve, you need to have risk tolerance. Now, the great business author Jim Collins, I mean, he said it well, bullets before cannonballs, right? Doesn't mean we go out and bet the farm on some new technology or a new crop or whatever the case is, but to take appropriate sized risk and
Baby.
to allow the next generation to do that, because oftentimes those founders, they might reflect on a father or a grandfather who, back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, they did some very innovative things, and maybe that set the organization, the farm, up for the success they're experiencing today. And yet they oftentimes fail to recognize that, just like in the corporate world, the business world, organizations are continually, innovating, that there's no difference. Again, we're talking about, in many cases, businesses, farm businesses worth, millions, if not tens of millions of dollars. They also have to look for those opportunities to continue to innovate. And oftentimes those ideas are going to come from the younger generation.
So be open. Be open to everyone's voice counting.
That's
And
right.
I just have visions of a lot of time in the word, there's this phrase sitting at the feet of Jesus. And I
Mhm.
think, wow, wouldn't that be a great position to be in, to be sitting at the feet of a servant-based leader that you can actually learn from and then start executing. But um, the other pillar that you talked about was relationships. And a
Mhm.
lot of farmers are sometimes lone rangers, Andrew, and
Yeah.
they work way too much. Like workaholism, I think in agriculture is a whole other piece around being lazy in relationship. And just, we don't have time to talk here. We don't have time. We just got to get and it's killing agriculture. It's killing relationships in terms of marriages. It's killing the dynamic of the next generation being able to use the successor effect for good growth. So what's what tell me more about the pillar of a servant-based leader in relationship. What's the key thing there?
Yeah, I love that question. And so just real quick to take it back to what you said about sitting at the feet of Jesus. I mean, when you look at leading Jesus' way, yeah, if you go to Luke chapter 22, Jesus basically articulates, Elaine, that there are two kinds of leaders, right? So beginning in verse 25, he's talking about the world's leaders, and he says the kings of the Gentiles, which just means the world, right? So the leaders of the world lord it over them. Okay, so that's the way the world would say to lead. I say it this way sometimes.
Yeah, yeah.
We all came out of the womb kicking and screaming, and for some of us, it never changed.
Okay.
And then he contrasts that in the next verse. But you, right? So particularly those of us who, would say that we're followers of Christ, he says, but you are not to be like that. Instead, the greatest among you should be like the youngest, and the one who rules like the one who serves. And so again, we see that, that is a clear command. Now, how does that relate to relationships? Again, when we think of the historical person of Jesus, He's called a teacher, he's called a rabbi, he was those things. And yet we see that people that were his followers, right? His disciples and Mary and Martha, so forth, they had true, meaningful relationships with him, right? He wasn't just a teacher. He wasn't just a rabbi. And the book says it this way: without trust, which is really the relationship piece, you might get compliance. You'll never get commitment. I mean, I was with a group of leaders the other day, and I said, tell me about the best person you ever worked for. And a woman in the room, about 50 years old, says, oh, right out of college, I worked for a woman. She was the best boss I ever had. She knew me. She knew my husband. She knew my kids. And she said, I would have eaten dirt for her. Right. And what is she describing? She's describing relationship. So we go further, faster when we're in relationship. And there's always going to be gaps, right, in our communication, in our organizations. When we have strong relationships, that gap is naturally filled with positive intent versus negative intent. Before we started recording, Elaine, I mentioned that after this, I'm going to go to my daughter's basketball game. And as I'm driving down the main street of our town, if I get cut off by somebody I don't recognize, if I'm honest, even though I'm here to talk about servant leadership, the first thought that comes to my mind is not necessarily positive, right? Hey, where are you going? Learn how to drive, these things. I'm just being totally transparent. But if it's somebody I know, right? If Elaine cuts me off at the light, somebody I know and I've got relationship with, I fill that gap with positive intent. I hope everything's okay, right? I hope nothing's wrong. Yeah. And so that's fundamental to the importance of strong relationships is in corporate, parlance, they call it psychological safety, right? Those strong relationships. And so I always say we're going to go further, faster if we have strong, intact relationships.
Well, and that also has a high correlation with trust, as you said also, Andrew. But my concern is the number of teary-eyed, and I had one this weekend when I was doing coach and call with the young farm leaders in Illinois, and the tears were flowing. And I said, tell me about the tears. And they said, oh, Elaine, you're the first person we've been able to talk about all of this angst we have over our transition because it just keeps pushing out into the future. We're just expected to work, work, work. And there's no relationship here in terms of what do you need that you're not getting. And so I've had young farmers say, Elaine, my dad still thinks I'm 12 years old, or I'm okay as long as I'm out there working. But, we don't ever have any fun together. Like one of the pieces of my key challenge audit, Andrew, is would you like to have more fun in your relationship,
Mm.
your family, in your farm? Yeah. And so your body is not a machine. So when you're coaching people to reevaluate the status. Like, I'd eat dirt for you kind of is obviously the extreme about this woman was willing to do anything because her boss took the time to develop relationship and really get to know what she needed. So how do you coach the young people listening to this? Because some people listen to my voice when they're going through a hard time. I had one listener say, Elaine, whenever I'm just having a hard day, I turn on your podcast so I can hear your voice because they find it calming. And that's what uh, I mean, Andrew, that's part of being present and staying calm. But my question is when the relationship is not what you hoped it to be, especially in a next gen relationship working on a farm, how do you coach that to shift?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Um, I think so. A couple of things come to mind there. Number one, again, if we come back to the heart of servant leadership, it's putting others, right, something or someone before ourselves. And so if we can come together as, multiple generations and really get clear on, again, what is the purpose here? Is the purpose for, Gen 1 to just continue to, run this and for me as G2 as an example, to basically be a hired hand? I mean, so a lot of whether you're talking about, work relationships, family relationships, marital relationships, right? Clear, open communication and clear expectations, I think are so
Where
important. Because if we can step back and see that we're really here to serve one another, right? And we're here for the continuity of the farm in many cases, then can we take a step back? And to your point, oftentimes they need somebody who's a little bit more of an objective third party, right? I'm working with a farm family right now, and in doing some coaching conversation with the second generation. Recently, I basically said to this individual, sometimes I feel like I'm missing your expectations, and I want to check in and see how's this working for you, and I mean, basically, this individual looked me square in the eye, and I totally missed the boat, Elaine. He said to me, "You know what? You challenge me. No one else does that, and I need to be challenged." Right? And so oftentimes we do need that objective kind of third party to help facilitate those discussions. But again, I'm going to take it back, and I know I'm sounding like a broken record. I'm going to take it back to that foundation, that purpose, vision, values. If we can take the time to clearly articulate those things and then let that be the source of truth, right? Not my emotions, not, all of these other things that cloud my judgment, but we can continually take each other back to that. And that's the last part of the model that we haven't gotten to yet. As you know, on the top of the model sits character. And it
yeah,
sits up there for a very precise reason, because at the end of the day, I can have a clear foundation. I can give lip service to all of these things. But to your point, Elaine, if I'm not living these things out day in and day out, the whole model topples over, right? And that's why we need to remove emotion, right? This is, well, Elaine, that's just your opinion. Andrew, that's just your opinion. No, no, no. We have to come back and look at this, right? This is what we've agreed to. This is the purpose for the organization. This is why the farm is here. This is our vision, right? This is where we're going. Jessie Lynn Stoner says the vision is a dream with a direction, right?
right.
These are the values, the definitions, the behaviors that are going to get us there. Is the way we're interacting with one another, is the way we're treating one another, is the way that we're planning for our future, is it aligned to that purpose, vision, and values or not? And then be able to step into, and this is where I think, really galvanizes relationships, is mutual accountability, right? So Elaine, if you're G1, Andrew's G2, it's not Elaine's opinion, even if her name's on all the paperwork, right? It's not Andrew's opinion. This is what we've agreed to. And how do we step into accountability, and how do we submit to one another? Because when we talk about relationships, one of the elements we talk about within that pillar, we actually look to 1 Corinthians 13, right? The love verses.
Love is patient, love is kind.
That's right. And
Love keeps no record of wrongs.
that's right. And we look at that and we tend to think of those as kind of character traits, character virtues, if you will. And of course, this, Elaine, but maybe for those that maybe don't understand, in scripture, we actually see three forms of love, right? There is one that's the intimate, like we would think of a husband and wife. That's why those verses are often recited at weddings. That is not the word that's used there, right? It's not talking, that would be eros. It's not phileo, which is kind of that brotherly love, that, Philadelphia. No, no, no. It's agape, right? Which is action oriented, right? Behaviors. So when you see that in 1 Corinthians 13, it's listing 8 behaviors of love. These aren't character virtues. So if I look at that first one, I mean, you hit it, right? Patience. If I say, well, Elaine, I'm just not a patient guy. That's not the way I was made.
I'd say not yet, Andrew.
That's right. That's right. But the reality is, if we keep going down that list, the last two are honesty and commitment. Well, if I apply that same pressure test and I say, Elaine, I'm going to do the best I can in this working relationship or this marriage or whatever this, but when it comes to honesty and commitment, I'm not real strong in that department.
Well,
All of a
then
sudden,
you don't have a place here.
yeah, that's right. That's right. But why don't we apply that same standard to all of those? There's a book out there called Lead with Love, LUV, and it's written by Colleen Barrett, one-time president of Southwest Airlines.
Ah, that would be a good read.
right? And LUV is the ticker symbol for Southwest Airlines. Most people would think it'd be SWA. No, it's LUV. So that book, Lead with Love, she talks about how they took those 8 behaviors of love from 1 Corinthians 13, and that shaped the culture of Southwest Airlines.
Yeah. And I think, when people have watched me speak, Andrew, I have a bottle of white glue, white LePage's glue squishing out onto the screen, and it says, culture is the glue that keeps your farm together. And so all of the things that we've talked about today, just to sort of tickle people's imagination about what would it look like on your farm if you had a culture of leading with love, of basing good decisions and behavior on your character, which I think is the umbrella, right? To all of those
Mhm.
other pillars that you talked about. And people say, oh, this isn't for me. Well, Andrew, just tell our audience you work with a lot of companies that don't have a faith base. But when they start practicing these principles, tell me what happens. Just tell the audience what happens.
I love that question. I say it this way, right? At the end of the day, all truth is God's truth. And
Mhm.
I have no hesitation to go into large corporations and teach biblical truths without necessarily using biblical language. And as you might expect, when an organization, individuals, teams, families put these principles into practice, I mean, the results are exactly what we would see, right? As we were talking about before, those 8 behaviors, come into alignment. And I mean, on our website, we've got case studies, right, of organizations, not necessarily faith-based, but we've got case studies on, profitability, sales growth. I mean, all kinds of metrics. And again, that's where even a lot of the data, of course, is in the publicly traded space. Those aren't faith-based companies. We already mentioned Southwest Airlines, Medtronic, Starbucks, right? I mean, there's a whole host of companies, not faith-based, but they do generally have a reputation for being people first, right? Southwest Airlines, Colleen Barrett, she said, you know what? We can't serve all people. You know who we serve? Our employees. Because we believe if we take care of our employees, they'll take care of customers. And if the employees take care of customers, they'll take care of shareholders.
So, Andrew, you and I could probably talk for 2 or 3 hours on this because you got this big smile of happiness and joy because you're obviously really aligned with the work that you do at Triune. If people want to find you, what's the best way to reach out to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So Andrew Leikvoll, Leikvoll. You can look me up on LinkedIn. Our website is just triune.org. And so you can take a look there, take a look at the work that we do, get in touch. We'd be happy to, better understand whatever unique circumstance, an organization or a family is working through and see if we can add value, or simply drop me an email at andrew@triune.org.
And for people who want the book, this is the
Yeah,
book.
absolutely. Leading Jesus Way. And there's more information on our website, or it's available on Amazon as well.
Great. Well, I really want to thank you for your time and your energy today. I don't know when we'll see each other again face to face, but folks, I get a lot of interesting comments when I mention things from a biblical principle, which is the way I want to live my life. And so, whether or not you are a Jesus follower, I just want you to know that, as Andrew said, these principles are something you might want to check out more and see how you can walk the talk in activating them in your farm family business. And even when I talk about conflict resolution, I say, well, what's your model of forgiveness? And people say, well, Elaine, we don't go to church. I said, that's not what I asked. I'm asking you, what is your model of forgiveness and where are you getting the character traits and the encouragement and the principles in place to give you the life you've always wanted in your farm, in your family, and possibly in other businesses. So thanks for joining us today, folks. I know that planting season is on the horizon for many of you as you'll be listening to this in the middle of April. Please know that at Farm Family Coach, we work all year round and we can coach and encourage you from the warmth and seat of your tractor, your pickup truck, or your kitchen. So reach out to us. Please share this podcast far and wide and let Andrew's words of encouragement make a real difference to you being a servant leader and see how wonderful that's going to be when you put these principles into practice. Thanks for parking your time with us. Please share us far and wide, and we'll see you next time. Bye for now.